Okay, so I might be a little late on this one since everyone was already talking about it weeks ago, but I'm gonna talk about it anyway. Ever since players got their hands on the final shape, there have been two major revelations. One, hunters are absolutely broken, and titans, well, kinda suck. Now, things should have looked good for Titans this expansion since their Prismatic kit on first glance seemed really good, and Titans have always been strong in some way. Sure, Banner of War Titan was nerfed this patch, but that shouldn't completely destroy the class, right? And I'd agree with you. So what is actually going on here? I think Titans have a problem that's a bit more deeply rooted than most players are thinking. Something fundamental to their design. So I'm going to take a closer look at Titans from this perspective to see if I can figure out what's going on here. Hey everyone, I'm Rizeki and welcome to my design analysis of the Titan class in Destiny 2. As always, thanks for checking out the video. If you're new here and haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Only about 13% of my viewers are actually subscribed, and you might not be one of them. So go ahead and tickle the sub button to be notified for all future uploads. I have a bunch of meta-analysis style videos in the works, and you won't want to miss any of them. But without any further ado, let's start talking about the issues with Titan. I want to begin by establishing a baseline for the core identity of the Titan class. Since we're taking a deep dive into the class from a game design perspective, we need to understand how exactly Titans wound up where they are today. Titans in Destiny embody three major pillars. 1. High solo sustainability, aka being the tank. 2. Team-wide defenses. And 3. A focus on melee attacks. I personally feel that all three of these do a pretty good job of describing Titans. While not encompassing everything, it should be enough for this video. What Titans don't have, the other classes make up for. Hunters are DPS monsters but are frail, and Warlocks are primarily team support and AoE ad control. Let's first talk about what made Titans so powerful when they were at the top. And it has a lot to do with the core design philosophy of the class. Most recently, Banner of War Titan took over the PvE meta. Before that, it was Solar Bonk Titan. Both Strand and Solar Titans have a very tight focus on self-sustain and powerful melee combat, both of which are part of our three major Titan pillars. Let's start with self-sustainability and what makes that so strong. Banner of War, pre-nerf, provided a ton of self-healing so long as you could maintain a chain of melee kills to refresh the Banner of War timer. Per stack, Banner of War provided an escalating healing pulse. This heal was so strong that it pretty much rendered all incoming damage useless. Combined with Woven Mail on Strand for easy damage resist, you could literally never die. The same is true for Solar Bonk Titan. Soul Invictus provided an insane amount of self-healing, so long as you could keep refreshing your powered melee, which only required you to pick up your hammer after throwing it. Today, both of these builds have been nerfed. They aren't dead per se, but certainly aren't what they once were. These builds were nerfed primarily because they were too effective with little effort required. Basically, just use melee, gain health. What is interesting here is that this is literally the perfect form of a Titan. Great self-sustain, mixed with a strong melee combat style. It just so happens that this particular gameplay combination is really strong. Funnily enough, it's the same reason Prismatic Hunter is so strong currently as well. What might be more interesting though, is that without this gameplay combination, Titans just fall apart. Once these builds were both nerfed out of the meta, it just became apparent to everyone. There's a great clip where I mentioned this prior to the release of the final shape when I was on the Cosmodrome radio podcast discussing the balance changes that were announced for the final shape. Yeah, when I was looking at every subclass and every class and like analyzing how they actually performed. Now, I'm not a Titan player by any means, right? So, you know, I didn't realize that Titan had so many problems, but then I started looking at their kit and I was like, there's nothing here. All of these subclasses are dog.
Like
what is going on? And like they have sustain, they have things in them, but like if you look at Void Titan, you can't activate half the stuff in the kit without overshield, and you don't have any tools to get overshield. Yeah. And it's like, what is going on? By the way, shout out to the Cosmodrome radio podcast. It's a great show, and I highly recommend it if you're looking for a Destiny podcast, especially the episode I was on. But what I was realizing while doing my State of series was that Titans kind of were just hanging on by a couple threads. Each subclass was built around a single core strategy, with the entirety of the kit revolving around that one loop, a single keyword. When a Titan subclass is bad or is just not performing well, it's usually because that particular subclass has an issue with its core mechanic. Let's look at Void Titan. I talked about this in the State of Void video, and it's still relevant here. Void Titan is built entirely around having Void Overshield. The problem? there really isn't a great consistent way to maintain this overshield on Titans. Obviously, you have tools like Bastion, but that is reliant on a somewhat long barricade cooldown. Otherwise, you have to focus on gaining overshield through exotics like No Backup Plans or Vexcalibur. It's just not consistent enough to warrant building into it. And let's be honest, the rest of the kit outside of overshield is very much lacking. You pretty much just have controlled demolition, or maybe unbreakable. Since the entire subclass is built off of overshield, you practically need to use a build around it, but because overshield is kinda hard to get, it just sours the whole subclass. Arc is similar. It's pretty much built around Thunderclap and Knockout, with other builds only being good when supported by external things like the seasonal artifact. Shout out to Hoyle Titan. Solar is built around sunspots with little support for them, and the most viable solar build has, well, been nerfed. Solar is now only used for Pyrogale gauntlets and really only for boss DPS. Strand lost the high sustain, which is literally what the entire subclass was built around. So there goes that. And Stasis is built around shattering stasis crystals, but it's fairly hard to have infinite crystals, and plus Stasis doesn't have the sustain that you would expect from a Titan subclass. Diamond Lances are there, but kind of feel out of place even if they're much better post-final shape updates. They just don't have much support in the subclass outside of their own aspect of the same name, and other things like exotics such as Lance Cap. What I'm trying to really get at is that the Titan subclasses are designed to be reliant on a single feature, and thus, the overall state of the subclass is entirely dependent on the state of that sole feature. It also doesn't help that Bungie leans too heavily into the melee aspect of the subclass. Each subclass tends to have the same exact gameplay loop with a different flavor. Punch heal, Frenzied Blade, Banner, Throwing Hammer, Soul Invictus, Thunderclap, Knockout, Cryoclasm, Tectonic Harvest, Shield Bash, Controlled Demolition. It's all the same. Sure, there are builds outside of the melee scope, but they never really were at the top like these ones. It's because Titan is just not designed to be flexible. While Hunters and Warlocks express their class identities in many unique ways, Titans always express it in the same exact way. And like I mentioned above, Titan subclasses are designed around a single core concept: gameplay mechanic, keyword, etc. So if every Titan subclass is a combination of one mechanic and melee, having either of those nerfed or changed exposes the issue with their kit design. The other reason Titans feel bad has to do with their sustain. Obviously, sustain feels great. Healing and damage resistance are the king in Destiny. There's a reason the resilience stat is the best stat in the game, and it's not just because the other stats are almost completely useless. Titans are the sustain class, at least for solo sustain. It's one of their core pillars after all. The number one pillar, in fact. Both of the top builds I mentioned, Solar and Strand, are heavily reliant on sustain. You just wouldn't be able to survive in a melee situation without it. Or if we look at the 5 subclass combos I mentioned above, each one contains a healing or sustain component. Without it, Titans would just be left with a melee build, and again, melee without sustain is very dangerous. Leaning into the Hunter Glass Cannon world. Sustain walks a very fine line between being not good at all, like on Stasis, or it could be too strong, like on Banner of War pre-nerf. With the number of difficulty levels in the game, across various activities, it could be very hard to strike a good balance for how much sustain should be allowed. Balancing around Grandmaster difficulty would probably result in too much sustain for lower level content, and balancing for lower level content would probably make you far too squishy in higher levels. Titans, by nature, will have more sustain than the other two classes, so it's even harder to find this balance for them. On Hunters and Warlocks, their sustain is not necessarily a part of their core identity, unless of course we're talking about Solar Warlocks. This allows these classes to care less about the overall balance of sustain. Titans rely on being the tanks to build up their core power fantasy, so any changes to sustain have a much greater impact. I'll reiterate it again. At its peak, Banner of War made Titans unkillable, and made players feel like gods running around the battlefield. Stasis, with its lack of sustain, makes you feel nearly useless in comparison. To sum all that up, sustainability is a core component of the Titan kit, and it just so happens to be one of the most sensitive systems to balance at the same time. Now, you've probably been wondering when I was going to talk about it. So here it is, the Prismatic problem. The whole reason Titans have been the topic of conversation. Had the Prismatic kit delivered on its power fantasy, I doubt people would be so vocal about the state of Titan currently. Everything I have already discussed has been an issue for a while, but it wasn't quite enough to sway the conversation. So what is it about Prismatic that got people all up in arms? To be honest, it's actually no different from anything that I already discussed. It's an extension of all the design issues with Titans up until this point. Remember, Titans primarily achieve their power fantasy through high self-sustain and are designed around a singular core gameplay loop. The only reason that the mono subclasses work well is because it's much easier to build into the verbs and keywords required for the core gameplay loop. For example, Strand could easily generate Woven Mail with various fragments such as Thread of Warding or an aspect like Into the Fray. With the mono subclasses revolving primarily around a single strategy, it forces the designers to create support mostly for that strategy. Prismatic, on the other hand, takes individual pieces from each mono subclass to make its kit. This results in a couple novel emergent gameplay mechanics, such as being able to have 3 consecration charges, but it removes the synergies required to make the vast majority of Titan gameplay work. Unbreakable literally synergizes with nothing in the Prismatic kit. Diamond Lances freeze things, but with no harvest aspect, you get no healing from shard generation. Drenger's Lash is okay on its own, but even on Strand, it was put aside most of the time in favor of other aspects, since it really didn't synergize with anything outside of fragments that dealt with Suspend. But of course, we don't even have Suspend-based fragments on Prismatic. The only aspect that really has synergies with the rest of the kit is Knockout, but only because melee abilities proc it. So this puts us in an interesting position. We need to take Knockout not only because it is giving us the most synergies with our kit, but also because it's literally the only source of healing and sustain. If you want to build into the core Titan fantasy, you don't have many other options, if any. So if we take Knockout, then we also need to make a melee build. So we probably opt for either Thunderclap for AoE, or Frenzied Blade for multiple charges of something like Consecration. And we are kinda just back to where we were before, a single combination of mechanics, just like on the mono subclasses. Knockout plus a melee ability. The difference being that we are also missing the secondary support that's built into the mono subclass kits. So, we are left with just the bare minimum, and that's why it feels so bad. Prismatic Titan stripped away all of the components surrounding the core gameplay loop, which helped to bolster that core. Even though I kind of bashed Void Titan earlier, you not only have the Bastion aspect to maintain the Overshield fantasy, but you also have supporting mechanics like Offensive Bulwark that add a little extra on top to the core. Strand Titan doesn't just have Banner of War, but they could also incorporate Suspend into their build to deal with different types of situations that the core melee heal combo doesn't necessarily account for. So although it's true that the mono subclass is boiled down to a single strategy, you could utilize other tools in the subclass to achieve a little bit more. Prismatic just doesn't have those supporting tools, so you're stuck with an underwhelming gameplay loop that doesn't provide much else. I guess you could call it one-faceted. The design of Titan subclasses is constrained around a single option, with the remainder of the kit revolving around it. Other classes like Hunters and Warlocks tend to have multiple equally viable builds since they are not reliant on entire self-sustain and melee attacks. On Titans, this over-reliance creates a situation where individual parts of a given subclass cannot be isolated and built around, which is why taking individual parts and building them into Prismatic felt wrong. It's not necessarily that those individual pieces are bad, but they were designed to fit within a single gameplay loop within their mono subclass, with little room to synergize with other mechanics. On top of that, Titans being designed around Sustain creates a tough balance situation where they could easily outperform every other class and trivialize difficult content like we saw with Banner of War. On the other hand, they could just as easily underperform in their core gameplay loop if that sustain is too low, as we've seen now with all the nerfs Titans have received recently. It's a very difficult balancing act, and it's a big reason why Titans can either feel overpowered or underpowered with little to no in between. If the designers at Bungie can create a sandbox where there are multiple ways to build Titans, all while maintaining them as the tank class, it would improve Titans across the board, and not just on Prismatic. Maybe healing and damage resist aren't the only things that could be used for sustain. Or maybe just give them a few more aspects on Prismatic to really give players something to work with. But maybe that's just my opinion. What do you think about Titans? Do you agree that they're missing something? Maybe you're really enjoying Titan right now and disagree with me. Let me know in the comment section down below or over in our Discord server linked in the video description. And of course, if you liked the video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. I've got more meta-analysis videos planned for the future and you won't want to miss them. But with all that said, I think that's all I've got for now. As always, I've been Rizeki, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.